Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see everyone. I just got here. I was running a little bit late. I walked to the other building and I got caught in a volleyball tournament or something like that. So I'm not sure if this is going to be quite as exciting, but hopefully it is. And my name is Danny Chazanoff. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at a company called Paysafe Group. And what I want to do today for about 30 minutes, give or take, is tell you a little bit about Paysafe, but more importantly, about our Canadian roots, how we got our start in Canada, and most importantly, how we support Canadian consumers and merchants. Our business really started out as an organization that supported businesses, enabling merchants to accept credit cards primarily or predominantly online, and that was about 20 years ago. So as you can imagine, things have changed quite significantly in the last 20 years. And I think what we've learned over that time is that as a global payments company, because we process and we service merchants and consumers all over the world, no two countries are the same, no two consumers are the same, and no two merchants are the same. And therefore, in order to be successful, you really need to understand both the merchant side and the consumer side of the equation. And for us, what we've also learned is that in order to satisfy the needs that our merchants have, that our clients have, we really need to understand the psyche and the behaviors of the consumers. And like I said earlier, a Canadian consumer is very different than a US consumer, that's very different than a European consumer. So we have that challenge to make sure that we can support various different business models and also understand what a consumer typically prefers when it comes to making a payment. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of Paysafe, because I think that will sort of lay the foundation and give you an understanding of where we come from and what we do, and that will morph a little bit into some more, I guess, relevant information about Canadian consumers and Canadian merchants. And again, our challenge as an organization is to understand the needs of both. And sometimes it's the merchant that dictates to the consumer how the consumer should interact, and at times it's the consumer that forces the merchant to behave a certain way to ensure that they're maximizing their return. What that means is to make sure that at the end of the transaction there's a payment, and that's what our company is responsible to do. So we call this All for One, the Canadian payments landscape and financial inclusion, and really that's a fancy or long way of saying we're going to give you a little bit of insight into some of the research that we've got our hands on, but also some of the research that we've done as an organization, so that we can share with you a little bit about some of the trends that are going on in Canada with respect to consumer requirements, consumer behaviors, consumer desires and requests as it relates to commerce, and in particular with making a payment, and what merchants are doing about that. And I guess where you'll see success, or where you'll have success, is where the merchants are providing the consumers with the choices and the needs in which they feel most comfortable with. And I think you'll also see, as I go through some of the data, that in some ways Canadian merchants and consumers are ahead of the curve, and we would be considered in some ways innovators, and in other ways we're a little bit behind the curve. And I think that has to do predominantly with Canadians in general being a little bit hesitant to adopt new technologies in some cases, especially if they feel in some way, shape, or form that there's a risk concern or a security concern. So again, like I said, I'm going to start off a little bit about the story, take a few minutes to give you that perspective, and then go into a little bit more about the Canadian landscape. So like I said, we started our company about 20 years ago, and what I'm most proud of is that I really can honestly say that we're a Canadian company. Now, you know, if you do your research on Paysafe or Paysafe Group and you follow the evolution of our company, perhaps you can make the argument that we're a European-based company. Why? Because the majority of our employees are based in Europe. We have 1,000 employees in Sofia, Bulgaria, as an example. We were listed as a public company on the London Stock Exchange up until about a year and a half ago. We were part of the FTSE 250, one of the largest companies in in the UK. So you could also make the argument maybe that we're a UK-based organization. We very recently got acquired by 2 private equity companies, one of which was Blackstone, based out of New York. And since then, we've made 2 significant acquisitions, both in the United States. We just hired a new CFO in the US, so I guess you could make the argument that we're a US-based company. But I guess for me, being Canadian, spent all my life, my career, and my education was all in Canada, I like to say that we're a Canadian company that services customers all over the world. And we got a very, we had a humble beginning back around 1997, where a few of us were part of an organization called BC Emergis, which was the e-commerce division of Bell Canada. And that was a long, long time ago. And we were doing some innovative things at the time, providing technology for online payments predominantly. And we just felt being part of a large telco, it wasn't conducive, it wasn't consistent with the entrepreneurial spirit that we had and this desire to really try and find ways of satisfying and servicing merchants and consumers for online commerce. Now, our company has changed a lot since then, and we're not only focused on e-commerce, and we're not only focus on Canadian commerce, but that's really where we got our start. And we started in 1999 when we left Emergis and created a company called Surefire Commerce. And that was in October of 1999. We built out our own gateway and technology and really started this journey that's been about a 20-year journey. And we were about 80 individuals in a Montreal office, and that's where most of our business was done. And it was not that easy to be a global company in Montreal when you needed to extend and expand your reach into the European market and into the US market. And over time, through acquisitions and organic growth, our company has evolved quite nicely. So again, 80 employees in Canada, 100% of everything that was done was pretty much in Montreal. And then we have grown to the point now in 2019, where we are over 3,300 employees, of which probably about 20% of those employees are based in Canada. And I'll show you a slide on that in a few minutes. So Paysafe Group, global company providing a lot of different products and services. And one of the things that we've recognized and realized as an organization is you could have 2 different philosophies. One philosophy is you could do one thing and one thing only and be really, really good at it. You know, you only get a percentage, in some cases a small percentage of the business. Or you could look to offer a wide range and a wide variety of products and services so that you can give choices to both your consumers and merchants. And as we've morphed our business has become not only a company that provides services to merchants, but also a company that provides services to consumers. And why is that important? Because like I said at the beginning, in order to understand the needs of the merchants, you need to understand how consumers, in our business, how consumers want to pay. We've grown our business throughout the world, 3,300 employees now, and we've taken the choice of doing as much as we possibly can to satisfy as many customers as we possibly can as it relates to payments. So instead of just offering a really good acquiring or payment solution for credit cards or debit cards, instead of just offering some innovative technology like wallets, we try and satisfy all the opportunities that are out there. And again, as a global company, because no 2 consumers are alike, no 2 merchants are alike, what we try to do is we try to offer as much variety as we can. So our business now consists of a few different categories. We have 2 digital wallets. We have NetTeller and Skrill, and that is those are 2 products that have been around for about 15 plus years, primarily servicing consumers in Europe. But Skrill just relaunched again in the US, and to some degree NetTeller and Skrill are used in Canada as well. They service a very specific need and niche where the merchant is looking to take money in and to push money out, and that has been very successful for us. I guess we could honestly say that we were probably the first company out there to develop a wallet or wallet technology before Apple Pay and before Google Pay and before all of those other products and services that are out there now. And the one difference, of course, for our wallets is that we're stored credentials. So it's not stored credentials, sorry, it's a digital wallet that stores balance. So what that means is it's an opportunity for consumers who want to buy something in the US, but they may be located in Europe or located in Asia, and they're not familiar with or they're not accustomed to using payments that would typically be used in the US. So what a US merchant can do is use NetTeller and Skrill to facilitate payments that are a little bit unique and specific for that particular geography. We have two other products. One's called Paysafe Cash, and one is called Pay Later. Pay Later is a consumer credit business, allowing consumers to pay by invoice or pay in installments when they go online primarily. Again, this is a service that's offered both online and offline. And again, what we've identified and realized that not all consumers want to pay for goods and services up front. Some consumers, especially with large tickets, want to pay over a period of time. 3 easy installments, 3 easy payments to get an invoice and to pay off the invoice. It's a very popular method of payment in Europe, and therefore we offer that now as well. So you as a merchant, if you want to offer credit, you can do that through Paysafe by offering Pay Later, which therefore means if the consumer wants to buy something for $300, they could make monthly installments of $100 over the next 3 months. Paysafe Cash is really cool in my opinion, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later as we go through some of the trends within Canada. And what that is, it's really a product that allows consumers to use cash online. That's essentially what it is. What does that mean? That means if you want to buy goods or services online, you don't have a credit card, you don't want to use a credit card as an example, you can take cash, you go to one of the distributors, we have 650,000 distributors worldwide, you give them the cash, they from their point of sale terminal provide you with a voucher. That voucher has a unique key or barcode, or you could pay in advance and get that barcode on your phone and then use that to buy goods and services. I'll give you a perfect example. So if you're online and you want to buy something for $500 and you want to pay cash, what you can do is you can select the cash button. That merchant through Paysafe technology will generate a unique barcode. That barcode will be delivered to your phone. You can then go within a certain period of time to a local distributor that supports Paysafe, show them the barcode, scan it, give them the cash. They will then send a note to the merchant telling the merchant that the goods have been paid for, and the merchants can now release the goods and services for shipping. And last but not least, income access. We also believe that it's important for affiliates and those independent organizations that are pushing consumers to try and buy goods and services in various websites to have a very sophisticated piece of technology and software in order to enable them to manage that behavior. So we bought a company a few years ago called Income Access that does that exactly. And the one other thing that's not on the slide is we also started a company called Golo. Golo is very local in Montreal, but is expanding into Toronto very soon. And it's very much like an Uber Eats kind of product where we provide a mobile app to merchants. And with that mobile app, they can develop a store and offer pickup and delivery through our Golo drivers and runners and bikers. And again, it's far less expensive than Uber Eats and Foodora and some of the other competitors. And what it does, it allows us yet again to create marketplaces and to have a very wide range of products for our consumers. And why am I telling you all this? It's not a plug for Paysafe at all. It's just to tell you that really, as a merchant, there needs to be a great understanding of consumer behavior, what the trends are, how consumers want to pay, and therefore to offer them the choices that they feel most comfortable with, whether that's paying now, paying later, paying with cash, paying with a wallet, and so on and so forth. Just to give you a little bit more insight into our Canadian roots, and this is really just a small snapshot of some of the businesses or partners that we work with in Canada, and there's a few that are not listed here. But for example, we have become the de facto payments provider for all of the lotteries. That's in British Columbia, Ontario, the Atlantic provinces, as well as Quebec. So anytime any consumer in Canada goes to play a casino game or to buy a lottery ticket online, they will be using Paysafe to process that transaction. We have a partnership with Paysafe in Canada. We service Ritchie Brothers, which is a large auction house selling large industrial equipment. Clearly is the largest provider of eyewear and contact lenses. And we have relationships with Desjardins, BMO, and all of the regular financial institutions in Canada out there. Again, making it quite a successful, at least in my opinion, story about our Canadian roots and how we have a good inventory of Canadian partners as well as merchants and customers. And then last but not least, just to give you some perspective on the size, like I said, we're about 3,300 employees, of which almost 600 are based in Canada. We have, like I said, our roots were in Montreal. That's where we got our start. About 450 employees in Montreal and about 140 employees in Calgary. And that really makes up Paysafe Canada. And then you'll see by the map, we have offices all over the US as well as Europe. And about 2 years ago, we opened up a development center, and we have about 150 technologists in Hyderabad in India. So Canadian consumers, like I said, in order to be successful, you need to understand consumers as well as merchants. And like I indicated at the beginning, our start was really servicing merchants. And by servicing merchants, we felt that, we want to listen to the merchant. We want to understand what the merchant wants. But sometimes the merchant doesn't necessarily listen to what the consumer wants. So we've done a lot of our own research to better understand the Canadian landscape. And we do the same in other countries as well, because like I said, no two consumers, no two merchants are the same, especially when they're in different geographies. So the first thing I wanted to share with you are some stats that we came up with, not through our own research, but research that was readily available to us. So just some interesting facts about the Canadian market. Number one, there's very few countries in the world that has the type of penetration as it relates to internet users as we have in Canada. So in the end of 2018, there were about 33.5 million Canadians that were online. That's 90%. We also have a very unique population where almost 90% of all adults are using smartphones. And they're not using smartphones for just the traditional calling and texting. They're using smartphones to do a whole bunch of things, including payments and commerce. And in 2018, last year, what I found quite interesting is that there were almost 4 million homes that had smart speakers like Google Home or Amazon Alexa. So why is that interesting? Again, it's interesting not necessarily because it's convenient to turn your lights on or off or raise your heat or play your favorite song, but it's also interesting because it's going to become, as it is elsewhere, the trend for doing commerce and making payments. So what are the takeaways here? Canada has never been more connected, again, from the web perspective, from phone usage, and now from devices like smart speakers. Canada and the population in Canada are really poised to use some of these platforms and technologies for commerce. We need to, as a payments company, take that greatly into consideration. So as these devices become used more and more frequently for mainstream types of activities and consumers become far more comfortable with them, what that's going to therefore mean is this is going to be the way in which consumers pay for goods and services, especially online. What also was interesting about Canada is I thought the numbers would be lower, but they were actually higher than I had anticipated, that about 1 million Canadians are unbanked. That means there's 1 million Canadians that don't have an affiliation with a bank of any kind. And further, there's about 5 million Canadians who are underbanked. The difference between unbanked and underbanked is underbanked means they may have some affiliation with a financial institution, they may have a bank account with some bank, but they really use it very infrequently and don't use many of the services that are offered. So what that means to me, or what that means to us, is that you have to be, as a payments company, a little bit sensitive to and somewhat innovative to provide different types of payment methods so that these consumers can buy goods and services, especially online. This doesn't mean that these consumers are not buying things. They're buying things every single day. It just means they're not using traditional banks that most of us use in order to deposit money or get credit cards or debit cards. So we need to to think about how we can service these consumers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But again, keep in mind some of the things that I spoke about earlier, like, for example, Paysafe Cash. That could be and would be and is actually a good alternative for those consumers who don't have bank accounts. So some of the takeaways here, there's a significant number of Canadian households that are low income or don't have traditional bank account affiliation or financial institution affiliation or typical payment vehicles like credit cards. And therefore, we as merchants or we as payment providers need to find ways of servicing them. And it's not a small percentage. We need to find ways to cater to these consumers so that they, in fact, can buy goods and services as easily as those that are working with banks. So we've done some of our own research. So like I said, that was taken from regular Canadian statistics that are readily available. But we also decided to do some of our own research. Again, still on theme with the fact that we believe that the more we know about our consumers, or the more that our merchants know about our consumers, the better off our merchants are going to be to ensure they maximize the checkout when goods and services are in the process of being purchased. So we did a survey of over 5,000 adults last year. And again, we didn't just focus on Canada, because we do a couple of things. Number one, we have businesses all over the world, so we need to be sensitive to and inclusive of all the areas that we do business. But it's also interesting to see trends and patterns. So not only to look at Canada by itself, but to compare Canada to other economies like in the US, Austria, Germany, the UK, et cetera, to see what the trends and patterns are there as well. We compiled this analysis and looked at it from two perspectives. We looked at it from the perspective of merchants that are doing in-store brick-and-mortar card present, and we looked at it as well from merchants and businesses that are doing it from a card-not-present perspective, what we call a non-face-to-face transaction, typically when you're buying goods and services where the merchant and the consumer are not physically together at the same time. We launched last year, and you can see that on our website, a report called Lost in Transaction, and it talks about payment trends. So again, if you go to our website, you can download that document. So a lot of the stats that I'll be talking about today come directly from that report. So I'm just going to go through a few slides to give you a little bit of background and some insight to some of the findings that came out. And again, this was specific to Canada in some ways, but we looked at the other geographies as well to make some comparisons. So, I guess I'm a little old-fashioned. I still write checks, but one of the things that we saw that 40% or 39% of Canadians wrote one check in the month. And I think that's a trend that we're going to see less and less of. Canadian check usage is way lower than the US. And again, we service a lot of merchants and consumers in the US. And believe it or not, over 50% of US consumers are still using checks to pay for goods and services. And we're doing far better than they. But if we look at some of our counterparts, they're doing a little bit better than we are, like in the UK, for example, where it's almost 30%, give or take, where consumers are still using checks. Why am I telling you this? Because we're looking at all the various ways, traditionally and maybe less traditionally, that consumers can pay for product, and therefore we want to give you a little bit of insight into where things are headed. So some of the takeaways is checks are still relatively important in Canada, perhaps not as important as they are in the UK, perhaps not as important as they once were, and certainly not as important as they are in the US, but they still play a factor. And aside from the UK, there's no other market that is less engaged. So, it's still a decent percentage, 40%. We see that we're doing a little bit better than some, but at the same time, when you look at the US, there's still a different trend. And in some cases, and if you look at EMV and some of the other technologies, the US is always following behind us and the UK. So what really does this mean? It means that consumers are using other methods for payment more often than that of checks. So if someone's writing a check once a month at most, and that's only 39% of the consumers, then obviously they're using other payment methods. In-store payments, one of the traditional in-store payment methods, still cash. So some interesting facts that we discovered when we did our analysis. 87% of consumers use cash in store at least once on one purchase a month. And in Canada, the amount of cash that a consumer carries in their pocket is far less than they did a year ago, and I think that's a trend that will continue. One of the stories that I tell all the time is, I have a 21-year-old daughter, and I'm always saying, do you need money? Do you want money? Do you need money? I don't like holding money, Dad. I don't want to have any money in my pocket. So I think more and more people are holding or keeping less and less cash. And in Canada, for some reason, ATM withdrawals still remain high. So even though we're not necessarily relying as heavily as we once did on cash, and even though we're keeping less cash in our pockets, we're still using the ATM quite frequently. So cash is not going away per se, and we have to take into consideration some of those trends that we're seeing as it relates to in-store transactions. Credit and debit. Probably still the most popular method for payment, both off and online. And also we see that there's been a trend for more and more contactless payments being made. And again, there are a lot of conditions around that and a lot of hype around contactless. I know in the US it's something that they lag behind, and it's something that everybody's stressed about going into 2020 with certain deadlines in certain verticals and industries. But this is something that we're going to see more and more of in Canada. So we still have a high usage of debit cards. This is for purchasing goods and services, almost 2/3. It's really, debit cards and credit cards are really the first and second most popular methods to this day. 90% of Canadians are using contactless. And again, I was surprised by that. I thought the number would be higher. I think there's nothing that's more convenient for small purchases that are made in store. We also are falling below some of our neighbors, like in the UK and Austria as an example. As you can see by the graphic, the US is far behind as well. But that seems to be a trend that's picking up a little bit. I still think there's a little bit of hesitation. Consumers are still a little bit nervous. They don't really know what it means. Putting your card against a point-of-sale terminal without putting in a password or a PIN freaks people out to some degree. But we're seeing that trend picking up a little bit. So again, these are some of the trends that we're seeing as it relates to credit and debit, not going away. Contactless is certainly a trend that is going to be growing in the coming years. Something that Canadians don't really embrace too much of, and this is something that we're hoping at Paysafe to change a little bit, and that is the usage of digital wallets. And I think that's for a whole bunch of reasons, some of which I described earlier. So one of the use cases for digital wallets is having a methodology to accept many different payment methods at one time. So if you were going to a merchant in the US that was international and they wanted to sell goods and services to everyone and anyone regardless of what country they were in, and they wanted to make it as convenient as possible, they would probably want to implement or integrate, a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen different types of payment methods, which is time-consuming, requires a lot of overhead, tons of reconciliation, and so on and so forth. So what a wallet can do in this use case is, with a single integration, you theoretically, as a merchant, have access to all these payment types. So therefore, one integration, you have access to all these payment types, and where it seems to be very beneficial is where the merchant wants to service consumers internationally. In Canada, for whatever reason, it's something that hasn't really been adopted or embraced. If you look at the more traditional wallets, Apple Pay, Google Pay, etc., and some of the failed wallets that came out a couple of years ago by some of the card brands, I just don't think Canadians see the value to the extent that some of the Europeans and even Americans have. And one of the things that you'll see a little bit later is that out of all the countries, for whatever reason, Canada as a country has the least number of payment methods traditionally and typically at the merchant's checkout. So that's very interesting, and maybe that's very much in sync with and related to the fact that wallets have not really been adopted to the extent that we would have hoped. So again, the second bullet, in Canada, credit cards still dominate, so 60+% of the payments that are made, especially online, are done with credit cards. Canadian online debit card lags a little bit, and that's always been an interesting phenomenon for me, whereby every single day that we have a large Canadian merchant that is going online, one of the first things that they ask after they implement credit cards is, we want to have Interac online, because Interac is very, very, very well used and very well well penetrated in the face-to-face world. And for whatever reason, Canadians have not embraced that. For whatever reason, when a Canadian makes a purchase online, most often, if not almost always, they're using a credit card as opposed to Interac. So what typically happens is we do the implementation, or the merchant does the implementation, and then within a couple of months they realize that the effort is not worth the benefit, in that there's only a few transactions that end up taking place. So it's a little bit of a contradiction, because on one hand, we want merchants to offer as many choices as possible to consumers, but the choices that they offer to consumers should be choices that consumers are really comfortable with and that they embrace. And Interac Online is one of those things that is a question for us. So some of the takeaways. Do we think that credit cards will continue to reign in Canada and be the #1 payment method? I think the answer for the short term is absolutely yes, especially when we see the trends with digital wallets and those not really embracing it in Canada. Debit cards have gained less traction online in Canada for whatever reason. Most people are using Interac as opposed to their credit cards for debit transactions, and the phenomenon has always been, or continues to be, Interac very popular offline, Interac less popular online. Mobile payments, wallets and watches, some of the new trends and innovations that are happening now. We talked about the smart speakers earlier. We do have a lot of Canadian consumers that are using their wallets on their phones to make transactions. There's about 43% of Canadians that have wearables or have Apple Watches or such type product that they're purchasing. But again, Canadians, I think, are really a little bit more conservative than some of the other consumers out there. They're still very concerned about fraud and security. I don't know if they're fully educated or up to speed when it comes to how this technology works and why it's safe. So we're seeing trends where it's being adopted, but not adopted at the same pace as some of the other geographies. And if you look at the graph as an example, you'll see in the US and the UK, there's far more adoption when it comes to that. I talked about it earlier about the use of cash. Just wanted to talk about prepaid cash, or cash as a replacement for products and services. Again, less about offline, because we all know that from time to time consumers and Canadians do use cash to make transactions in person. But we're seeing that now there's an opportunity, based on some of the demographics and some of the information that we're finding about Canadian consumers, where cash is a little bit better for groups like the underbanked or the unbanked. So you'll see that 4% of Canadians are using online cash. It's very low, but I think that's one of the areas that that's going to grow. Prepaid card usage is a little bit higher, where about 13% of Canadians are using prepaid cards. And again, that is one methodology for consumers to be able to convert cash into a platform that is accepted online. So you walk into the local Shoppers, you give $100, you get a prepaid card, and then essentially what you're doing is converting cash into the ability to make purchases online. So given the Canadians' ongoing relationship with cash, there appears to be a space for some sort of disruptor to allow for cash to be used more frequently and in areas and places where traditionally it hasn't been used before, like online. So what we thought we would do is just give you a quick example of something that we've done at Paysafe that is very much in line with understanding what the consumer wants. We created a partnership with PaySimply that provides an online portal for consumers in Canada to be able to pay taxes and bills. So hydro bills, phone bills, etc. And we launched that right before the tax deadline so that we can see whether or not consumers would actually start using cash as an opportunity to pay their taxes online. And it worked out quite well. And basically what happens is that you go to PaySimply, you say who you want to pay, who the payee is. It could be a business like Hydro. It could be the government for taxes. You determine how much you want to pay. They will generate a barcode. You will then go to one of the Paysafe affiliated distributors, so Canada Post would be one. You would show them the barcode, they would scan it, you would give them the cash, they would send a message, an electronic message to the payee that the bill's been paid, and there you go, you now have the ability to use cash to pay for hydro, phone, miscellaneous bills, as well as your taxes. So again, what we decided to do is when we built this out with PaySimply, not only did we make it available for cash, we also made it available for wallets and some of our other technologies, again, trying to be sensitive to Canadians that are looking for other options to make payments, especially when it comes to provincial, federal tax and utilities. And then last but not least, on the consumer side, we're still seeing a lot of hesitation for the adoption of some new technologies. I talked a little bit about it when it comes to wearables and such. So there's still a little bit of concern with respect to consumers not being able to understand the technology, not really understanding the risks associated with it from a security perspective, from a fraud perspective. So only 23% of Canadian consumers, which I found quite low, are using frictionless apps. And what's a frictionless app? Sort of like the Starbucks app when you go and you buy your coffee with your phone. We looked at it from our own perspective. Like I said earlier, we have our own app called Golo, which is based in Montreal, soon in other cities as well, or Uber Eats. Not as many Canadians as we would have thought, especially in comparison to some of the other countries, are adopting frictionless apps to the point that we thought they would. And I think that's going to come over time as Canadians become a little bit more educated and a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more in tune with how the risks are actually mitigated. So some of the takeaways, although it's growing in popularity and it's really cool and trendy, especially for kids, frictionless apps in Canada are still not yet mainstream. We're hoping that improves, certainly from our perspective. That there needs to be more education, and that education needs to come from a variety of places, but where it needs to come from most are the businesses themselves. I think Starbucks has done a great job, but there's other businesses out there that need to do the same kind of thing by promoting, educating, and explaining to the consumers why the frictionless app is more convenient, easier, better, and so on. And one of the other things that we're also noticing is because there are so many devices being installed in people's homes and a lot more smart homes available and people using devices to do regular day-to-day activities, the next obvious trend is going to be to use these devices to buy goods and services and to make payments as well. So that sort of gives you a little bit of insight to some of the things that are going on in the Canadian marketplace as it relates to consumers. In some areas we're ahead of other countries. In some areas we're behind. I still think that we're relatively conservative in some areas. I would hope and I would like to see things like wallets and things like frictionless apps to become a little bit more mainstream, and I think they will over time. And I think that we as payment providers or payment professionals or merchants need to ensure that we are sensitive to that and we're helping the consumers with that journey and making the leap from the more traditional payment methods to stuff that is a little bit more innovative. Just very quickly, that's only one side of the equation, and sometimes it's the merchant that drives the consumer, and sometimes it's the consumer that drives the merchant as it relates to payments. So just a few more minutes just to talk about some of the data that we got from the same survey and the same research on the merchant side. So the same way that we surveyed about 5,000 or a little more than 5,000 consumers, we surveyed about 600 merchants in card not present, that we wanted to understand what they were seeing from a trend and behavior perspective at the consumer side. And again, we want to make sure that we marry the needs and requirements of the consumer with the requirements and the types of payment methods that the merchants are providing. So we compiled an analysis of how many payments or how payments are evolving for card not present and small and medium-sized businesses, and whether they see payment innovation and user experiences as a critical way to differentiating. So meaning, like I said before, the more the merrier, the more the better. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. I think we'll see in the next few minutes what we've discovered as it relates to offering a wide variety. So very quickly, Canadian merchants that are providing online card not present transaction. This is showing that in Canada, we offer the least number of choices. And maybe that makes sense to you, maybe it doesn't. But if you look at some of the other areas, US, UK, Germany, and Austria, they're all at 4 or higher. Now, it's not a huge difference, but I think that over time, the other countries are growing at a much faster pace than we are in offering choices. And like I said earlier on, for our consumers who are underbanked or unbanked, which is maybe about 15% of the population, we need, as merchants and as payment professionals, the ability to tap into that market. We also want to show that Canadian merchants are using traditional online methods for payment. That credit cards still remain, as I said before, the most popular way for Canadians to pay for goods and services. Debit cards are still offered and used in a lot of cases, but like I said, Interac Online has not had the penetration or the traction that we would have hoped. And Canadian merchants are still above average compared to some of their peers. So again, no surprise. Canadian consumers and Canadian merchants are still very bullish on credit cards, but they still need to accept and understand that these trends are going to be changing. And considering the fact that there's lower debit card usage by Canadian consumers, it's interesting that that the small and medium businesses are still using Interac as a choice. And that's a bit of an anomaly to me, the fact that there's a lot of merchants that are offering it, but the usage is very low. One of the things that we do a lot of at Paysafe, and I think is important for a lot of merchants, especially if they are offering their services and their goods internationally, is alternative payments. So alternative payments are helpful in the own geography. So in Canada, for example, there may be alternatives like pay by cash, and that would be an alternative. But as you start expanding into the US, but more relevantly beyond the US into Europe and Asia and other countries, if you're doing commerce there, you need to be sensitive to the fact and aware of the fact that there's a large number of very unique and specific payment methods that are only related to those particular geographies. And therefore, Canadians that want to do business internationally need to find ways of offering these alternative payment methods. And you'll see that in Canada, in some cases, we're doing a little bit better than in other countries, some cases not quite as well. But again, I think that we believe, and what we've seen from the survey, is that merchants want to offer as many choices as they possibly can, and they still think that perhaps there's a way of embracing and bringing in digital wallets. I guess lastly, just Canadian merchants, again, and I think this is very much on theme with what we talked about earlier with respect to consumers. They want to offer as much as they possibly can. I think they've foregone this perspective that more is more complicated. I think now they really are looking at more is better. The more options that we can provide, the more alternatives that we can provide, the better it is, because not, like I said, and it's a recurring theme, not, no two consumers are the same. Every consumer has their unique profile and their unique desire and their unique preference on how they make a payment. So what you'll see here is that on average, we have about 4.2 different payment methods. When you go to checkout, you have approximately four different options, and in Canada it's a little bit less. And I think that everybody's expecting that there's going to be more and more and more ways to pay, and there's going to be some innovative ways that are not necessarily things that exist today, but certainly there are things like pay by installment, pay by cash, pay by wallet, use alternative payment methods, which will be things that you'll see more and more of, especially in Canada. And that's really where the merchant and the consumer comes together. So just to conclude very quickly, just a few takeaways that I think sort of wraps this up. Is number one, I think it's important to note, and I said it a few times, that, and it was a surprise to me, the level of underbanked and unbanked as a population in Canada. It's much higher than I thought. And therefore, it's a market that needs to be addressed as far as payments go, and we need to find ways, merchants need to find ways, and payment professionals need to find ways of servicing those clients. One way, of course, is cash, but there may be other ways as well. So again, looking for an online cash replacement method, whether it's Paysafe card or Paysafe cash or something else, doesn't matter, but finding ways for those types of consumers to be able to do commerce the same way that their peers do that have bank accounts and work more traditionally with financial institutions. Also seeing that even though credit cards are still king and they reign as number one or the number one option, there are opportunities for us to start looking at alternatives. So traditional payment methods are still declining a little bit, even though, like I said, credit card is still the number one option. And digital wallets and other types of payments such as those are becoming now a little bit more mainstream. And again, they should be looked at and focused on as options for merchants to be using to satisfy consumers in general, but more specifically, some of the consumer trends that we talked about. Frictionless apps, we talked about that a little bit, and voice and crypto payments are certainly on the radar, not mainstream at all yet. Again, I thought the adoption rate was relatively low for frictionless apps. I was surprised. It's something that will definitely grow. Crypto as a payment method is something that will definitely grow. Probably not for the next short while, but definitely watch this space, because I could tell you from personal experience, we're spending a lot of time in our technology labs looking at different opportunities to embrace and take advantage of things like crypto as a methodology to make more mainstream payments. So overall, the Canadian payments future should feature more choices, and we talked about that, and diversity and financial inclusion. Again, taking into consideration sort of the behaviors and the trends of the consumers in Canada. And Paysafe, again, not a plug, but again, just to give you some perspective, that we, our philosophy as an organization was not to focus on any one single payment method, but to really look at the wide scope of opportunity and to be maybe not everything to everyone, but to have as many options as possible, because again, what we've seen is the more options for the consumer, the better it is for the merchant, and more transactions and more commerce can take place. So that's it. Hopefully that was informative, and really appreciate your patience. I know it was long, but have a great show, and thank you very much.